We are all billionaires when you consider that each brain consists of about 86 billion neurons, which is the topic of today's discussion. As we continue the biological basis of behavior, the neuron is the building block of the nervous system, and neurons vary in sizes and shape and have different functions. Today, we're going to be looking at the neural anatomy of the neuron, the connectivity, as well as the type of communication. So let's break it down like a fraction and put it back together, beginning with the neural anatomy. So the neuron has a cell body, which is the hexagon looking area with the eyeball looking object in the middle of it. This contains the nucleus. The dendrite is the tree branch structure extending from the cell body. And the dendrites receive inputs from the neurons. A little way to remember is dendrite, Dumbo, remember the elephant with the big ears, Dumbo, dendrite, ears. They receive the information. And then next is the axon. This is the long tube extending from the cell body. And the terminals at the very end that look like roots, these are the axon terminals. The extensions can be 1 millimeter all the way to 1 meter. And this carries information from the cell body. And most cells are multipolar, meaning that they have multiple dendrites and axons. And last but not least is the myelin sheath. This surrounds the axon. They're the arm floating pad looking objects around the axon. And these are insulating fatty layers that help speed up information transmission. Next, let's talk about the connectivity, meaning that the capacity for the interconnection and intercommunication to take place. What is needed first is the neurotransmitters, and these are the chemical messengers such as dopamine and serotonin. And so we know that there's different types and different effects, and one makes you feel good, and one makes you sleepy. And so these are the messengers within the brain. And then there's the synapses, which you need, and that's the space between the two neurons. There's the presynaptic neuron, which sends the neurotransmitter, and the postsynaptic neuron, which receives and has the receptor. So I use this little picture here to help explain that. Now I'm from Indiana, but it's definitely Chiefs Nation out here in Kansas City. And as you can see, an analogy is the football's like the neurotransmitter that is sent from the presynaptic neuron. In this case would be Patrick Mahomes, the quarterback, throwing the neurotransmitter, and the postsynaptic neuron, which would be Clyde in this example, is the receiver, and the neuron that has the receptor and receives the neurotransmitter. So that's a little analogy to help you remember what's happening there. And this communication, as we look into a little more in depth, it has electrochemical communication. It's just a fancy way of saying that there's electrical charges as well as those chemicals such as the neurotransmitters are involved. In this, we'll try to break this down as simple as possible. Basically, when the neurotransmitter is received by the receiving neuron on its dendrites, it's either excited or inhibited, which is the result of receiving the neurotransmitter from one neuron to another. Then an action potential occurs. If the neuron fires, that means it's excited and it has reached the minimal threshold that is needed in order for it to fire. Just like water has a boiling point of 100 degrees. Once it hits that, it boils. Action potentials have a certain charge that needs to hit for the neuron to fire. And when that occurs, it sends a signal down the axon, the long tube that we just discussed earlier. Now, this communication is all or nothing, meaning that either a neuron fires or it doesn't. An analogy is a firearm. When the bullet shoots, it either shoots or it doesn't shoot. And so that's what we mean by all or nothing. And after this takes place, there's a refractory period in which after the neuron fires, the neuron is unable to fire again until it reestablishes an electrochemical based resting potential state. The best analogy I can use that is when you flush a toilet, you got to wait for it goes through the cycle before you can flush it again. And so all this is what plays a role in dopamine being released, or feeling good, or you feeling tired, neurotransmitters neurons and all the action potentials, all that plays a role in this. So I know we covered a lot of grounds, but let's summarize it up and remind you that neuroanatomy, these are the brain cells. They're divided into the cell body, which contains the nucleus, the dendrite, which receives input information, receives the neurotransmitters, the axon, which carries the information, and the myelin sheath that speeds up the transmission of the information. This connectivity that's needed for this process to take place is neurotransmitters, which are brain chemicals that cross the synapses. Once again, that's that area between the quarterback and the receiver, that gap where the pass happens. And this is the space between the two neurons, the presynaptic neuron, which is the quarterback, and the postsynaptic neuron, which is the receiver. And then the electrochemical communication is where all this takes place and happens. And that's when the neurotransmitter is received. It sets certain actions into motion, which takes electrical charge. Once it hits enough charge, that threshold that it needs, the neuron fires, it sends information down the axon, and it's an all or nothing process, which requires a waiting period before that it can occur again. We have our references, which is the EPPP fundamental steps, also the fundamentals of human neuropsychology. Thanks for listening. Be sure to follow me at Skelton_neuro, Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok. Subscribe to the Skelton Report and check me out on Udemy, where I have e-courses for minorities as well as motivation and goal setting. I'll check you out on the next go around. Peace.